Just after midnight on May 1st, 1971, a 20-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ford was sleeping on a couch in the front room of a small house near a city in Arkansas called Texarkana. Elizabeth and her husband Bobby were staying at the house with Bobby's brother and his wife, who actually owned the property. Bobby and his brother were still awake, and Elizabeth could hear them talking in the kitchen quietly. The house was surrounded by thick woods and swampy land, and Elizabeth had opened up a window above the couch so a cool breeze was blowing in. Now, usually, she slept really well with the sound of the woods in the background, but tonight she was tossing and turning. And this was because, as she lay there trying to sleep, she became very aware of a unique sound coming from outside that was not the sound of the trees blowing in the wind or the insects buzzing. This was something else. It was a slow creaking sound, and at first it kind of sounded like it could be out in the woods somewhere. But eventually, Elizabeth realized this creaking sound was sort of moving back and forth, right outside on the porch below the open window. Suddenly, Elizabeth's eyes flew open and she looked at the window because this creaking sound had just intensified and then came to a stop on the immediate other side of this window, like there was something heavy right outside. Elizabeth sat up to face the window, but she did not see anything outside through the screen. And so, right away, she felt totally relieved. She did not know what that sound was, but clearly there was nothing there. However, just to be certain, she decided she would go a little bit closer to the screen and actually look right up close to make sure there was nothing down below on the porch. And so Elizabeth leaned forward and pressed her face to the screen and began to look. And as she did, this dark figure down below suddenly rose up and completely blocked out the window. Elizabeth was looking at it, having no idea what it was, and before she could do anything, this huge thing slashed at the screen. And this big, reddish, furry, brown paw with razor-sharp claws cut through the screen and nearly cut Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth screamed and practically fell over, and this dark creature outside turned and bolted and disappeared, and then, a moment later, Elizabeth's husband, Bobby, and his brother came running into the room asking what was going on. Elizabeth was so shocked at what she had just experienced that all she could say to her husband was, "It is a bear. It is a bear." Bobby helped Elizabeth off the couch, and then told her and his brother's wife to stay in the house and away from the windows, and then Bobby and his brother got shotguns and flashlights and went outside. Once outside, Bobby and his brother began scanning all around the porch area where Elizabeth had apparently seen this bear to see where it was. They held their flashlights out and they scanned the tree lines. They looked all over the place, all around the front of the property, but there was no sign of this animal. And so the brothers looked at each other and nodded, and then they both left the porch and went in different directions, kind of looping around the back of the house. They were going to scan the entire property and meet up at the back. And when they met up at the back, they still had not found this bear. And so they walked away from the house towards the tree line and did another big sweep together of the entire perimeter, again looking for any sign of this animal, but there was nothing. And so after a while of circling the property, the brothers decided that, this bear must have just run off. And so Bobby and his brother returned to the porch to figure out their next move. Both Bobby and his brother were experienced hunters, and they knew that usually the best thing to do with the bears that roamed this area was to just leave them alone. I mean, these bears could grow to be 500 pounds, and if they were provoked, they could run at 35 miles an hour. And so, generally, you just stayed away from these things and they would leave you alone too. However, as the brothers were sitting there talking through what had happened that night, they both said, it definitely seemed like this bear was different. I mean, apparently, it was aggressive enough to come right up to the house unprovoked and reach in and swipe at Elizabeth, which obviously was not normal bear behavior. And so, to Bobby and his brother, this meant that they really could not just leave this bear alone. They had to go out there and find it and kill it to protect themselves and their family. And so, Bobby lit a cigarette to calm his nerves. And then the two brothers came up with a plan for how they were going to go find this bear. Bobby's brother would man the front of the house, and Bobby would man the back of the house. And they would stay in their respective positions monitoring the property until either they saw the bear and dealt with it, or until the sun came up, at which point they could go get help. And so, after agreeing to this plan, Bobby took one final drag on his cigarette, chucked it to the ground, and then, with a shotgun in one hand and his flashlight in the other, he stepped off the porch and walked around to the back of the house and stared off into the darkness. Bobby had only been in the back of the house for a couple of minutes manning his post when he began to smell this horrible smell. Now, at first, he thought it was just some sort of wet, musky smell that came over from the swampland nearby. But as he continued to smell it, it got heavier and more pungent. It smelled like a wet, decaying animal. Bobby tensed up and aimed his flashlight up at the tree line and began looking back and forth, trying to figure out where this horrible smell was coming from. And as he was doing this, he suddenly heard the sound of tree branches snapping off to his left. And so, he whipped his flashlight over and shined it. And he saw this big, dark figure charging across the property, away from him into the forest, Bobby instinctively raised his shotgun and fired. And then after shooting, a loud yelp echoed in the air. And then Bobby just took off running in the direction he had just fired. And as he was running across the yard, he was screaming for his brother, who had already heard the shotgun blast. So, his brother was coming around the house, and the two men linked up, and as they were running in the direction of this bear, Bobby was telling his brother, "I think I got it, I shot the bear." But they got over to where Bobby had last seen it and where he heard this yelp come from. And there was nothing. There was no bear. Still, the brothers did feel a little relieved. They figured even if they could not find this thing, clearly Bobby had hit it, he had heard the sound of it yelping out. And so, maybe by at least wounding it, it would stay away and leave them alone. But just then, the men heard the sound of their wives screaming from inside the house. The men immediately ran back to the house, and as they got closer, Bobby again began to smell that horrible smell. And right as Bobby's foot hit that first porch step, his brother from behind him screamed out, "Stop!" But it was too late. The bear was on the porch, that's why the women were screaming. They had seen it. And Bobby's brother had seen it, but Bobby had not. And now he was too close to it to get away. And before Bobby could raise his gun to protect himself, this thing attacked. And Bobby felt this horrible burning, tearing sensation in his arm. He fell to the ground, twisting wildly back and forth, trying to protect himself. He was pinned underneath this enormous bear, level with its chest, with its arms and legs on either side of him. And that horrible smell he was smelling was clearly coming from this animal. That's all he could smell from underneath, but just then it was like a miracle because to his side, Bobby could see there was an opening. And so he rolled and somehow got out from underneath this enormous creature. Bobby scrambled up to his feet and he darted past the bear and rammed into the closed front door of the house. It popped open. He fell inside and his wife ran forward and shut the door behind him, leaving Bobby's brother outside on the porch alone with the bear. But before any of them could do anything about that, they heard the sound of his brother's shotgun going off. Then there was a long moment of silence. Inside the house, everybody was frozen. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened and Bobby's brother walked inside. Everyone was too shocked to say anything. So for a second, they all just stared at each other. And then finally, Bobby asked him, "Is the bear dead?" And Bobby's brother, with a trembling voice, said no, and that was not a bear. As soon as dawn broke and it was not dark outside anymore, Bobby's wife drove him to the hospital where they would treat him for shock and for the wound to his shoulder. Bobby's brother stayed behind on the property along with the police, who had finally been called to investigate. They had hoped to find the creature somewhere on the property, either dead or wounded, based on Bobby's brother's account of having fired at it, basically point blank. But the creature was gone. They did find its tracks though, and this discovery made it clear that Bobby's brother was right, that this was not a bear. Because in the dirt surrounding the house were all these bizarre footprints and handprints of a creature that seemed to walk on its hind legs with 3 toes on each, and had 3 long, sharp claws on its hands. And as unbelievable as this all seemed to the police, this actually tracked with what Bobby's brother said he saw when he was out on the porch. He said he saw a creature with reddish-brown hair all over it that stood over 7 feet tall, and after being shot, it took off running on 2 legs, and it ran incredibly fast. But the most terrifying thing about it, at least according to Bobby's brother, was actually its eyes. They were blazing red. And when the news of this attack spread to the nearest town, which was called Folk, the people there knew exactly what this creature was. For 200 years, people in that part of Arkansas had been talking about this huge creature that was sort of like a Sasquatch that roamed the forest and the swamps. They said it was fast and elusive and it ate livestock and pets. They called it the Fook Monster, or sometimes the Boggy Creek Monster. But Bobby Ford and his family's encounter with this creature was unlike any other story that had been told about the Fook Monster. While some people claimed in the past that this creature had attacked people, nobody had ever heard of it actually coming up to somebody's house, trying to break in, and terrorizing a family. Bobby's ordeal would actually inspire the 1972 horror movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. Over the years, police officers and some scientists have suggested that maybe what Bobby and his brother encountered that night was actually a feral pig. However, authorities have never actually been able to pinpoint what this thing was. Nobody knows. And to this day, hikers and hunters near the swamps of southwest Arkansas and also across the border into East Texas still report run-ins with the legendary Fook Monster. If you think that encounter in the woods of Arkansas is hard to explain, let us move forward a few years and travel to rural Texas, where 3 people experienced something even more bizarre, something that would leave them with physical scars for the rest of their lives. Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car while her 7-year-old grandson named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The 3 of them had just had dinner at a local truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark, wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicky began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicky turned on the defroster, and as the windshield began to clear, Vicky noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicky just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicky really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it did not really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicky thought this was just kind of interesting and she was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicky was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly. And so Vicky sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Does this light have something to do with the heat they are experiencing in the car? And then, all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicky screamed at Betty, "Stop." Betty jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the source of that strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft. It was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this was happening. But then Vicky, who is sitting there still panting and sweating, she is looking out and she is realizing this craft she is looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen in her life. The craft was a bit bigger than a car. It was diamond-shaped and it was letting out these strange, loud, roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud, roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out of the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there, right over the ground, appearing to be aimed directly at Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was absolutely terrified. But Betty, the driver, she said she could not go anywhere. The road was too thin and she could not really turn around very easily on this narrow highway, and she certainly could not drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames, and so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicky and Betty sort of looked at each other and thought, okay, we are just going to wait it out and hope this craft eventually flies away. But after several minutes had passed, the craft still had not departed. It was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground. Vicky and Betty are like, well, let us get out and see what is going on here. Let us investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out and Vicky tells her grandson, stay in the car. So Colby is right there, and Vicky gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view of this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so, all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her, but just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so, this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard, like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so, Vicky got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who is still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so, Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it, and then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft like they were escorting it. And then, the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a United States military exercise of some sort. And so, a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat. Vicky climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well, and for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there was nothing blocking their way anymore. They are just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby got out. They said goodbye to Betty. They did not really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt. And at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also did not feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that maybe the reason they were sick was because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time. But eventually they both did fall asleep. And then, when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him, to see if his skin was all blistered and red. And she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10 or 15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately, Vicky was worried that if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number and she listened and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty did not answer. Now at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic. Not only because she was worried about Betty, but also she did not really know what was wrong with her or with Colby. She did not know if their sickness was going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky did not have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so, as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, to drive to her house and check on her, she could not. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone, and Betty would tell her that yes, she is also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet, and so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for her, and eventually Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so, feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, turned the handle, and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed, and Betty looked absolutely horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so, Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside. She scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what is going on with Betty? Do you know what happened to her? What is going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, "You know your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body." He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible. So that could not be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so, without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about the strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend so sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to the story. So, by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital, she was in constant pain, she still had burns all over her, and in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with. But it was like everybody they told about this aircraft did not believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so, Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she will pass this along to the senator and he will be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so, Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she did not want to call this place. It was a UFO research center, and Vicky had not called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO from outer space. She believed it was a secret military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier because now she is claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options, so she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple of days later, a scientist named John Schessler drove down the winding, wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of his spare time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so, with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here, that this was not aliens, this was something ordinary like a government aircraft. And so, John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then, eventually, they both left Vicky's house. They hopped in their respective cars and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there and John got out of his car, he did not need Vicky to direct him to the specific site because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road. As if the road itself had been melted and then resolidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said that's where it was, that's where the craft was hovering, those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here. But John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so, he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses. And he told her he would keep her updated. So, Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John did not really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he is some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes asking if they had seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So, John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimony, saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and resolidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft, But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it does not matter. It does not prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so, the bottom line was the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he could not stop thinking about the case. And so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change, except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker. And Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they had come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they did not find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement, the strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It is now known as the Cash Landrum incident after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it was not an unidentified flying object. To this day, the United States government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say, when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they could not actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he is still alive and continuing to seek answers to this day. If you think a mysterious radiation-emitting craft on a Texas highway is terrifying, let us move to Decatur, Alabama, where a young mother found herself dealing with a mystery illness that was slowly stealing her life away. And what she discovered about the source of her sickness was far more insidious than any government cover-up. One afternoon in November of 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Potty was on break at her job in the city of Decatur, Alabama. And while she was sitting in the break room, she pulled out her phone and she called her 21-year-old daughter, Hannah. The phone rang a couple of times, then eventually Hannah picked up, and right away Nicole could tell her daughter Hannah was still very much not feeling well. She could hear it clearly in her voice. So, Nicole's daughter was a stay-at-home mom to two very young kids, which was totally exhausting in its own right. And in fact, on this phone call, Nicole could hear in the background the sound of the kids yelling and running around and crashing into things. So, clearly it was just chaos over there. But Nicole knew Hannah could not just be tired from tending to her kids. Because over the last couple of months, what Nicole had noticed was every time she spoke to her daughter, whether her daughter's kids were going crazy or not, Hannah just completely sounded under the weather. And in fact, Hannah was often complaining, again over the past few months, of not only feeling a deep exhaustion, but also of feeling really dizzy and nauseous. Now, over the past few months, Nicole had been telling her daughter, "You have to go see a doctor. This is not normal. This is not just parenting fatigue. Something is off. You need to go get looked at." But Hannah, who was known to be very tough and, generally did not really go to the doctor much, she said to her mom, "I am fine. I am just exhausted from the kids. It is no big deal." And so she kind of pushed that idea aside. And so this time, as Nicole is talking to her daughter, and she can clearly hear that her daughter is not better, she is still feeling awful. She knew trying to push her daughter to go see the doctor was not going to work. So instead, she said, "Okay, Hannah, when is Brian going to be home?" Brian was Hannah's husband. And Hannah just sighed and she said, "No, he is not home yet. I do not know when he is going to be here." So for the most part, Brian was a very active parent and husband, but he also was a very successful chiropractor. And in fact, he had had so much success at his private practice that recently he had even been able to fully renovate his building. And so with this new building and all this extra space and all this new staff, He was working even more than usual, which financially was great for the family, but it meant he basically was absent all the time. And so it had become kind of commonplace that Brian was nowhere to be seen. It was kind of Hannah alone with the kids and this mystery illness she was suffering from. Now, Nicole obviously understood the nuance here. She knew that Brian's practice was very important, not just to him, but to Hannah and their family. And so, instead of being upset with Brian, Nicole had tried very hard to make herself available to her daughter, to take care of her kids, to help her out whenever she could. But there was a limit to how much Nicole could help because Nicole also worked full-time. And so, she could not just be around all the time to help with her daughter. Like today, she was working. She wished she was not so she could go be with her daughter, but that was just the way it was. For the next couple of minutes, Nicole and Hannah just chatted like mother and daughter. And then, at some point towards the end of the call, like Nicole always did, she told her daughter, "Hey, I really think you ought to go to the doctor. If you tell me what day you are going to go and you make an appointment, I will go over and take care of your kids. I will even take you to the appointment. Whatever you need. Do not let logistics be the reason you do not see a doctor. Whatever you need, you let me know, and I will help you if I can. I will flex my schedule to accommodate yours." But like Hannah always did, she just kind of brushed off her mom and said, "Okay, maybe I will go see a doctor, I do not know, but I think I am going to be fine. I am going to rest, I am going to take vitamins, I am going to eat well, I am going to do all the things, and I am sure this will pass." Nicole sighed when she heard this because basically she hears her daughter saying, "I am not going to the doctor still." But Nicole did not argue. She just told her daughter that she loved her and she would see her soon, and then the two hung up. Over the next few weeks, Hannah continued to feel completely awful, nauseous, dizzy. All of her symptoms persisted and in some ways even got worse. But no matter how much pressure was put on her, namely by her mom, to go see a doctor, Hannah did not. She really had convinced herself that this was just parenting fatigue and that she would just get through it and she would be fine, which again was sort of very much her personality. She was this tough, hard-charging woman. She was going to just grit this one out. But then, finally, in January of 2022, now it has been months and months of Hannah having these symptoms and her mom basically begging her to go see a doctor. And by this point, Hannah cannot argue with the fact that she is basically falling apart. She has lost so much weight, she actually cannot even walk around her house anymore. She literally sits on a swivel chair, like a desk chair, and just pushes herself around the house. She is absolutely sick, and it is something that she cannot even deny anymore. And so finally, in January of 2022, Hannah says, "Okay, Mom, I will go to the hospital." Nicole, in some ways, was incredibly relieved that finally her daughter is doing the thing she should have done a long time ago. And then, also, Nicole was just so annoyed with her daughter. Like, why did you not go sooner? This is so silly. But regardless, Nicole is like, "Great." She tells her daughter, "I am going to come over, pick you up, I am going to take you to the hospital, I will be there with you." And so she goes over to Hannah's house. And when she gets there, Hannah in her chair wheels over to the door, and Hannah looks awful. She looks like she weighs less than 100 pounds. She is so pale, her hair looks like it is falling out. She looks absolutely sick. She looks like there is something seriously wrong with her. But Nicole, she just takes her daughter and assists her down the stairs, puts her in the car. She also gets her kids and brings them along as well, and they drive to the hospital. And when they get there, eventually Hannah is brought into an exam room along with Nicole and the kids. And a nurse comes in and they begin checking Hannah's vital signs and asking her some questions. And they also weighed Hannah. And eventually, after that was done, the nurse told Hannah, "Hey, you only weigh 84 pounds. This is way below what is considered healthy. This is like an emergency. And based on the other things you are telling me about over the last few months, having these symptoms, I am worried you might actually have stomach cancer." Now, even though Nicole had anticipated that something seriously was wrong with her daughter, it still hit her like a freight train to hear that her 21-year-old daughter might have stomach cancer. She had never even heard of somebody that young having stomach cancer. And when Nicole looked over at her daughter, Hannah, too, was horrified. For her, she still believed this was all just going to pass, that whatever this was, it would go away. But obviously, stomach cancer is not something that just goes away. A couple of minutes later, a doctor came in the room and explained to Hannah and Nicole that the next step here was to test Hannah to see if she actually had stomach cancer. Now, the doctor said it was entirely possible this could be something else. But again, based on all the symptoms you have described and the sudden, extreme weight loss, unfortunately this really does appear to be stomach cancer. But we are going to check, and in a couple of days we should have an answer. And so, Nicole and Hannah, despite obviously being shocked and scared, they both said, whatever we need to do, that's what we are going to do. A few days later, Nicole was at home when her phone rang, and it was her daughter calling. Now, to this point, Hannah had gone in and begun doing some of the tests to see if she had stomach cancer. And they were waiting for some of the results to come back. And so when Nicole saw this call coming in, she is thinking, oh my goodness, this could be it. I could be getting the call where Hannah has been told one way or the other about this being stomach cancer. And so, with quite a bit of anxiety, Nicole answered the phone, and when she heard her daughter was not telling her about test results. Her daughter, she was speaking in such a low tone that she could barely hear her, but she basically croaked out to her mother that she felt so sick she had to be taken to the hospital right now. And so Nicole dropped everything, sped over to her daughter's house, and when she found Hannah inside, it was like Hannah could barely move. She was so fatigued, she was so sick, so pale, so skinny and malnourished, it was like her daughter was dying. And so she scooped her daughter up and she rushed her to the hospital. Later that day, Hannah was in a hospital room and was stabilized. When she had come in, she actually was showing signs of what is called acute respiratory failure, which basically meant her lungs were shutting down. And in fact, one of her doctors had told Nicole that had Nicole not gone over there and rushed her daughter to the hospital on that day, very likely she would have died. She would not have survived another 24 hours at home. So, this was as close as you can come to your daughter dying. But they had been able to stabilize Hannah, and she was now resting in bed, and they were now trying to figure out what to do. And one of the doctors pulled Nicole aside and said, "Look, we know she is being tested for stomach cancer, and we do not know if she has that or not yet, but acute respiratory failure is not connected to stomach cancer. And on top of that, it is incredibly rare for someone as young as Hannah. So we really do not know what is going on here. All we can do is keep her here, keep her stable, monitor her, and run some additional tests." And so Nicole said, "Okay, let us do it." And so for a few days, that's what the medical staff did. They just continued to monitor and keep Hannah stable while testing her to figure out how somebody her age and in her condition could be contracting respiratory failure. But after a few days of this, out of nowhere, Hannah has this severe, sudden seizure. But after her seizure passed, the medical staff began investigating Hannah's brain because a seizure is a brain-related event. And as they are looking into Hannah's brain, they discover that she has also contracted viral meningitis, which is inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. And generally speaking, viral meningitis is not life-threatening, but in rare cases it can be. And considering the fact that Hannah had other very serious medical issues going on and the fact that her particular viral meningitis case was very severe, doctors were worried that she could be someone who could die from this meningitis or potentially have very serious brain damage if they did not do something drastic to combat the swelling in her brain. And so, a decision was made to put Hannah into a medically induced coma so that she would lay perfectly still and they could just wait for the swelling in her brain to go down. But what that meant functionally was that Hannah would be in this coma indefinitely until the swelling goes down in her brain, or who knows what. I mean, basically, the doctors did not know what was going on with her. However, just a couple of days after Hannah had been placed in this medically induced coma, some of her imaging tests came back from all the testing they had run on Hannah to try to figure out what was going on here. And in particular, there were these imaging tests that came back from her abdomen. They had scanned her abdomen, and what they discovered inside of her abdomen was truly shocking. Hannah's entire digestive tract was covered in white spots, and the doctors all knew that those spots were not cancer. They were something worse. And after running a few more tests to confirm their theory, once they had that information that, yep, what we suspect is going on here, they called the police. So, remember Hannah's husband, Brian. He is the very successful chiropractor. Well, his practice had been so successful that he had had the funds to fully renovate his office and build this bigger, better chiropractic practice. And that was great, not just for him, but also for Hannah and her whole family. They were making money hand over fist. Everything was great. Except there was an issue. One of the upgrades that Brian wanted to do within this renovated space was to include an X-ray room. And when people build X-ray rooms, they actually line the walls of the room with these big sheets of lead to keep the radiation from penetrating the walls. But lead is incredibly toxic and harmful to humans, especially if you ingest it or you touch it. It is not something you really want to interact with at all. It needs to be kept at a safe distance. But after the renovations were done and the X-ray room was built, there were several sheets of lead that did not make it into the walls. They were sort of extra sheets of lead that just did not get used, and they were out in the open. And when police discovered that and they began investigating, they found somebody had been shaving off pieces of those extra lead sheets, little bits of lead. They were shaving them off and planting them inside of Hannah's vitamins that she took religiously every day, believing those were the things that were going to make her healthy again. But in reality, sort of ironically, they were doing the opposite. She was literally poisoning herself every time she took one of those vitamins, and who was the person who was shaving off all that lead and literally trying to kill Hannah? Her own husband, Brian. All those white spots inside of Hannah's digestive tract were literally just pools of lead that had accumulated inside of her because her husband had been trying to poison her to death for months. Miraculously, though, Hannah would survive. After nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma, Hannah was healthy enough to be woken up and got to go back home with her kids. As for Brian, he was arrested, found guilty of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His motive was the $1.3 million in life insurance policies that he had taken out on Hannah. Now, if a husband trying to poison his wife with lead shavings from an X-ray room is not terrifying enough, let us travel across the world to a remote village in South Africa, where a young man faced a nightmare that came running out of the dark woods, a creature that the villagers believed was a demon sent from a burning mountain. On the evening of August 1st, 25, a 20-year-old man named Fraser Baloy walked alone down a main road toward his village in the South African province of Limpopo. Fraser was on his way home from work, and he was pretty desperate to get there. It was only about 7:30 p.m., and usually around this time, Fraser was used to seeing other people out and about on this road, just kind of walking around in the dusk or chatting or doing various errands, but tonight there was nobody out there. And in fact, in recent days, this area of Limpopo had basically become a ghost town. Nobody went out unless they absolutely had to, because over the last 10 days, over 20 people in this area had been brutally mauled. The victims had all insisted that the creature that had mauled them was some kind of four-legged demon, and they had begun calling it the Beast. Now, Fraser considered himself a pretty level-headed person who did not necessarily buy into the hype around this beast. He figured it was very likely just a wild dog, but still, he did not want to get attacked. And so, as he walked down this vacant road, he periodically looked over his shoulder just to make sure no dog was following him. As Fraser continued to walk along, he looked up and saw the huge forest fire that was raging on a mountain miles off in the distance. A few days ago, the fire had started, and from Fraser's perspective, it still seemed to be going strong. In fact, in the darkness, it almost looked like the mountain was glowing red. Just then, Fraser noticed the turnoff for the shortcut that would take him through some forest back to his home. And when he got there, he stopped and looked over his shoulder one more time to make sure he was still all alone, and he was. And then he stepped off the main road, into the woods, and into the darkness. Under the tree canopy, the night suddenly seemed a lot darker. Fraser did his best to think about the chores he needed to do for his mother once he got home, instead of thinking about the beast. But he had only been on this path for about 300 feet when he suddenly heard a rustling from behind him. And so, right away, Fraser stopped and turned around and looked where the noise was coming from, but all he saw was darkness. There was nothing there. And so Fraser, for a whole minute, just stood there staring out into the tree line, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. And so Fraser told himself he was just being paranoid, everything was fine, and then he turned back around and kept on walking, but pretty quickly, his walk turned into a jog. And he was almost to the end of this path, almost out of the forest. He could see his village, it was right there, when he heard noises behind him again. Except now, in addition to the rustling sounds, he heard a new sound. It was like a wheezing sound, like a sick animal that was breathing heavily. Now, Fraser knew he was not just being paranoid. Something was out there, and it seemed like it might be following him. Without slowing down, Fraser looked over his shoulder again to see what was out there. But again, he just saw nothing. It was just shadows. However, when he turned back around and kept on going towards his village, he heard this loud crashing sound behind him, like a massive animal had leapt out of the brush and landed on the path behind him. And so Fraser was immediately so scared he could not even turn around. He just started sprinting toward the village, and all he could hear behind him were these loud, pounding footsteps as whatever this was gaining on him. And so Fraser was so instantly terrified that instinctively he just started sprinting without even looking behind him. And so, as he is running, this thing's gaining on him. And again, he can hear this awful wheezing sound coming from whatever this is, as if there was something wrong with its lungs. And in Fraser's panic, as he is sprinting through the forest, Fraser's telling himself it has just got to be a rabid dog. That's why it is making those sounds. But he knew that did not track. This thing is huge. This cannot just be a rabid dog. And so Fraser just kept on running and running, and finally he got out of the trees, back into his village, and at the exact same moment, the pounding footsteps behind him came to a stop. But again, Fraser, he did not turn around. He was too scared. He just ran for his door. His house was right there in front of him. And he gets to his door, he is about to open it up, and right as he does, he feels this searing pain in his neck. This creature, whatever it was, had leapt and grabbed onto him and bit down on the back of his neck. And so Fraser crumpled to the ground and threw his arms up over his head to protect himself. And with one eye, he could see it as this massive black creature on top of him, chewing on the lower half of his face. And so Fraser, he could not even feel any pain. He just began screaming for help. And he tried to push it off of him, but he could not. And then, a second later, a flash of metal came across his eye as his mother and other villagers who had seen this happening and heard him screaming, came out and began smashing whatever this was with shovels. And so, a second later, Fraser's pulled away and dragged towards his house. And this huge black creature, it marched over to the edge of the tree line and just stopped, turned, and looked back at Fraser and his mother and the neighbors. And Fraser, as he is sitting there in total shock, he can tell that whatever this thing is, this enormous dog-like creature, this had to be the beast. That's what just attacked him. And in this moment, Fraser realized, this creature may have the shape of a dog, but it was not a dog. South Africa has its share of wild dogs, jackals, and hyenas. And typically, they are multicolored and fairly small. And this thing was jet black, pitch black, and gigantic. And when this thing first started chasing Fraser, he had had that panic thought that maybe it was a rabid dog. But rabid animals are typically lethargic and confused. And this thing that was 15 feet away from them was absolutely alert and calm. The only thing sick about it was that horrible wheezing sound it would make as it breathed. And as Fraser and his mother and the neighbors just stood there staring at this thing, this creature just continued to stare back at them with piercing eyes. And its eyes were not normal. These were not like animal eyes or dog eyes. They were too small and set at the wrong angle. And there was real sentience behind them. They were human eyes. Just then, Fraser's mother grabbed Fraser and yanked him, kind of jerking him back to reality. And he scrambled to his feet, and he and his mother and the two neighbors, they took off, running back into their respective homes. All the while, this creature just sat there on the edge of the forest, staring still in the direction of Fraser and his home. Once inside of Fraser's house, his mother immediately dialed the emergency number to tell the police about what had just happened. But the police told her they were not going to send people out there to deal with some dog. And so, Fraser's mother decided she would just treat her son's wounds on her own until this dog-like creature had left. And then, once it had, she would get him a ride to the hospital. However, as Fraser and his mother stared out the window at this creature, it did not leave. It just sat there, staring back at Fraser and his mother with these hideous human eyes for hours and hours. Finally, in the morning, it was gone. The attack on Fraser was the last straw for the people of his village. They believed the creature that had bit his face was the demon beast that had hurt so many other people. And so, the elders of Fraser's village came up with a plan of how to deal with this beast. And so, a few days after the attack on Fraser, this group of elders went off on a journey up into that mountain that Fraser had seen off in the distance that had that huge forest fire on it. They were there for 2 whole days before returning to the village and telling everyone that they had successfully performed a ritual that had appeased their ancestors. And so, hopefully now, the attacks would stop, and sure enough, they did. They did not see the beast again. At least 40 people in Limpopo had encountered the beast at some point, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off like the neighbors did with Fraser. But because this beast was never caught, and it did stop attacking the village and just kind of disappeared, nobody ever actually figured out what it was. To this day, people in Fraser's village maintain that this creature was a demon, and that it came down from the burning mountain because every person, including Fraser, who had encountered this beast, noted its wheezing, heavy breathing, as if its lungs had been damaged by smoke. In all, at least 40 people in Limpopo encountered this beast, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off. But because it was never caught, there is no definitive proof of what it actually was. Now, if a beast with human eyes in South Africa leaves you questioning reality, let us return to the highways of Texas, where a young man named Brandon Lawson went missing in the middle of the night. His disappearance would trigger one of the most baffling, frustrating mysteries in modern history, one that went completely cold for 9 years. At 12:30 a.m. on August 9, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was asleep in his bedroom with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when his cell phone rang and it woke him up. Kyle looked at the caller ID and saw that the call was coming in from his 26-year-old brother, Brandon. And so, Kyle picked it up, but before he could even say hello, his brother said he needed help. And then he launched into this big story that really sounded completely insane. He told Kyle he was currently driving north on Highway 277, which is this totally desolate 2-lane country road that runs through West Texas, and that 3 men were chasing him. And on top of that, Brandon told his brother that, he is trying to get away from these men, but his truck was about to run out of gas. And so, what he wanted Kyle to do was to right now, in the middle of the night, come meet him secretly to hand off a gas tank so Brandon could officially escape these 3 men. But as Kyle listened to this, he was not really actually concerned, at least in terms of Brandon being in any sort of real danger with regards to these 3 men that were chasing him. In reality, Kyle's reaction to this was just being so annoyed at Brandon because after hearing this story, this frantic story Brandon is telling him in the middle of the night, he was sure that really there were no 3 men, that instead his brother Brandon was just high again and he was hallucinating. He was basically having an episode that was substance-induced. So, Brandon had a history of methamphetamine use. He had been clean for the last 6 months or so, and he had been working on being a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and also a better father to his 4 children. But just 2 days ago, Brandon had also called Kyle, but it had been to ask Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Now, Kyle did not immediately say, "Oh, here is where you go to get drugs." Instead, he tried to tell Brandon, "Do not do it. You should not get high. You are clean. You are doing so good." But he was pretty sure Brandon had not listened because ever since that phone call, even though Kyle did not give him any resources for drugs, Brandon must have gone and gotten drugs anyway, because his behavior had just been completely crazy in general. In fact, right now, Kyle knew from having spoken to his parents earlier that the whole reason Brandon was even driving on Highway 277 right now was because he got into a big fight with his fiancée and was supposed to be going to his parents' house to chill out. Like, he was basically going to time out for bad behavior. That's why he was out right now. Now, Kyle knew Brandon was very likely high, and so this was not going to be a good time to reason with Brandon and tell him to, just come home or just go to your parents' house because there is no such thing as these three men. You are just high. He is not going to listen to that. So instead, Kyle just focused on trying to calm Brandon down because, again, Kyle is not thinking Brandon is actually in danger. He is thinking this is just a hallucination. But as Kyle tried to do that, Brandon did not calm down. He got more and more anxious, and he is continuing to talk about these three men that are gaining on him. And finally, Kyle just said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what is going on here?" But as Kyle expected, Brandon swore up and down that he was not high, and he just kept on begging Kyle to come help him fast before these men caught up to him. Like, "Come give me the gas I need so I can escape." Come on, man. At this point, Kyle felt like there was no point even talking to Brandon. And in some ways, he just wanted to hang up and forget about this whole thing. Like, this was crazy. He has his own life and his own responsibilities. He should not be babysitting his younger brother. But at the same time, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even if he resented it, he did love his brother very much. And even though he did feel like there is no imminent danger here, other than maybe Brandon to himself, Kyle decided, you know what, I am just going to go out on Highway 277. I am going to find Brandon and just get him back home. So he told Brandon he would be right there, and then he hung up. About 45 minutes later, Kyle drove north on Highway 277, along with his wife in his passenger seat and their 4-year-old son in the back. Kyle's wife had not wanted him to be out in the middle of the night dealing with his crazy brother all alone. So she had insisted that she and their son come along. And so as Kyle drove down the road, he kept an eye out for Brandon's truck. Now, to set the scene for you, this really is a desolate highway. There is no real traffic, and really in either direction, it is just kind of open plains and some shrubs and small trees. Like, this is a big, wide open area. It is pretty easy to see way out in front of you, and so he has got a great view even though it is nighttime, but he cannot see any vehicles. Like, there is no truck, there is nothing. His brother is nowhere to be seen. But Kyle just kept on driving and kept on looking out. But he was even just sort of looking out into the fields in case, his brother had veered off the road somewhere, which seemed entirely possible. But eventually, after driving for some time, way up ahead, sort of parked half on the road, half off, was a truck. Its lights were off. It is just sitting there. It is not even idling. It is clearly turned off, but as Kyle got closer, he realized it was Brandon's truck. So he had found Brandon. And so Kyle, he pulls over to the opposite side of the road and he parks his car and he tells his wife and his son to stay in the car and he is going to go talk to Brandon, who at this point Kyle is assuming is sitting in his truck waiting for Kyle. And also keep in mind, at this point, Kyle is thinking, well, there is nobody else out here. There are no 3 men chasing my brother. He is probably just sitting here high as can be, and I am going to talk to him, and he is just going to go home and we are going to move past this. But when Kyle walked over to the vehicle, there was nobody inside of it. Brandon was gone. And he is thinking to himself, this really does not make any sense. Because on the ride to the truck, as they were on Highway 277, Brandon kept repeatedly calling Kyle over and over and over again, being like, come on, you gotta hurry up, you gotta get here, they are gaining on me, like, I am in trouble, bring that gasoline, you gotta get here. And now that he is here, he has finally reached clearly Brandon's truck. It is right here. And Brandon is gone. He is gone from his truck. He did not tell him that on the phone, like, where is he? What is going on here? And so Kyle, he is like looking under the vehicle. He is searching the vehicle now for his brother, which is totally crazy. Like, what is his brother doing here? But as he is searching the vehicle for his brother and looking around the area for his brother, Kyle's phone rings, and it is Brandon. And so Kyle, who at this point is feeling really annoyed, he answers the phone and he is like, Brandon, where are you? And Brandon goes, bro, I am right here. And Kyle is like, no, you are not. Like, I do not see you. There is no one here. Your truck is here, you are not here. But just then, Kyle looked out and there was a car coming towards him. So he saw the headlights and he realized it was a cop car. And so he is on the phone with Brandon. He is looking out at this cop car that is coming up this road towards him and clearly slowing down like the police officer is going to stop and talk to Kyle, presumably. And so as this cop car is coming in and slowing down right in front of him, Brandon on the phone says to Kyle, run away from that cop. Now think about this. That meant Brandon had to be somewhere nearby because he can clearly see the cop car approaching Kyle. He is watching the scene. Even though Kyle has not found his brother, Brandon is clearly actually nearby. But Kyle, he is sort of quickly interpreting this, and he is thinking, like, where is Brandon? Because he is looking out, and it is just open fields in either direction on either side of this highway. It is like this barren wasteland out in the middle of Texas. Like, where is he hiding? There is nowhere to hide. There are a couple of shrubs and really small trees sort of off in the distance, but there is really nowhere to hide. So, where is Brandon? And Kyle, he is just feeling furious at this point. Confused, but furious. It is like, what are you doing, Brandon? He knew the reason Brandon wanted Kyle to run also is because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest that had to do with a drug charge. And so, he is just protecting himself, like, do not get involved with the police, keep me out of it. And it is like Kyle, he is already out here in the middle of the night doing this crap for his brother who is completely off his rocker. He was so annoyed. But again, it is like, what does he even do? He has no idea where Brandon is. And so Kyle, he was about to say something to Brandon to demand, where are you? Come out here, but Brandon hung up now. By this point, the police officer had arrived on scene. He had parked his car and he walked over to Kyle, who now is standing right next to his brother's vehicle, and he has put his phone back in his pocket. And the officer, when he got close enough, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department. And he told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker about a stranded driver on the road. And so he asked Kyle if maybe that was him. Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver? Pointing to Brandon's truck. But Kyle said no, it was not his. It belonged to his brother. But despite how much he really wished he could say the truth, he wanted to protect his brother. So he could not tell the deputy that, the reason my brother left his car here is because he is probably high on meth and he is somewhere nearby hiding, and also he has a warrant out for his arrest. So instead, Kyle said, I think he went off to get some gas because he called me and he said he had run out of gas. So he parked his car here, so he probably has walked on and, I just got here. Is it okay with you if I get back in the car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon, because I am sure he is fine? But he called me to help get him gas. So, do you mind if I do that? And surprisingly, the deputy was like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. And so, Kyle, he got right back into his car with his wife and his son, and he did fire up his car and he drove farther down the highway, and as he did, he kept looking over his shoulder to see what the cop was going to do. And the cop was just still parked next to Brandon's car. And eventually, when Kyle drove far enough that he knew the cop could not see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road and he began really angrily calling his brother over and over and over again to get him back on the phone. But Brandon never answered the calls. And so, at this point, Kyle has no idea what is going on with Brandon. I mean, he did not before, but now especially he is out of contact with his brother. And so, Kyle and his family would sit there for a little bit longer, continuing to try to get in touch with Brandon, but to no end. And eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son began crying and complaining because it is so late and he is tired, and, Kyle's wife is tired. It is 2 a.m. and Kyle, he is just so over it. He is like, you know what, Brandon is an adult. I tried to come out here and get him out of this mess, but if he does not want to be in touch with me and he wants to hide off the side of the highway, that's on him. I am taking my family and I am going home. And so, that's what he did. He turned around, he drove right back the way he came, and he actually passed by his brother's truck that was still there. So, Brandon clearly is still in hiding. And standing next to his brother's truck is still Deputy Neal. He presumably was waiting for Brandon to show back up. Kyle drove right past them, he went back to his home, and they went to bed. And he figured, you know what, tomorrow I will likely hear from Brandon, and he will tell me some crazy story explaining what really happened. But you know what, whatever, that's on him. Not long after Kyle had driven past Deputy Neal on his way back home, Neal decided, you know what, I am not just going to sit here all night waiting for Brandon. He had searched Brandon's truck and there was nothing concerning inside of it. There was, no phone, no wallet, no keys, things that people would not leave behind if they ran out of gas and decided to go walk to get gas. So it seemed very much like that is what happened. Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and begun the walk, and then his brother showed up and the whole thing was playing out here. And so Neal figured, okay, well, I have other calls to go to. It does not seem like this is a huge emergency. And so he just reached inside the truck, he turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them. And then he got in his own vehicle and he took off because, again, he had other calls to attend to that night. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Deputy Neal was back out on Highway 277 just to make sure Brandon had eventually come back and claimed his truck. But no, the truck was still sitting there, hazards on. Now, at this point, Deputy Neal was starting to get a bit concerned about Brandon because, he is out on foot walking to get gas for his truck. And even though it seemed like the risk was sort of low for him, it is possible something could have happened to him, and that's why he had not come back to his truck. Maybe he was hit by a car or got lost or something. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or, maybe Brandon decided not to claim his truck yet. Maybe he just went home and he is going to get it later. But regardless, it just seemed like Neil really had to go follow up personally with Brandon, just to make sure he was okay. And so, Neil drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could find the contact information for Brandon. But when he walked in the door, he did not have any time to do any digging because another employee told him that while he was out, the department had gotten a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had given them a very different story than the one Brandon's brother Kyle had told Neil the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past few days. And last night, so on the night that this whole truck thing happened, Brandon was supposed to be on his way to his parents' house to cool off from the fight he was having with Ledessa, but he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back to Ledessa's house. And so, Brandon was totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with Brandon. They were calling and texting him, but there was no response. After hearing this, Deputy Neil was surprised and also pretty angry because clearly Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie because Ledessa is saying this totally different story. And so, the first thing Neil did is he went and spoke to Kyle and also to the rest of Brandon's family to get the story straight here. And very quickly, it became clear to Deputy Neil that any omissions or even lies about what had happened exactly on the night that Brandon went missing were not because the family was hiding something. I mean, they were kind of trying to protect Brandon, but it was because they did not understand how serious this situation really was. And so, now that Brandon really was missing and nobody knew what happened to him, the family was very forthright that they really did not know what had happened to him, and that yes, maybe he was on drugs, we do not know, but he really is missing and you got to go look for him. And so, that's what Neil did. Over the next 4 days, there was this huge search that Neil led all around Highway 277, where the center of the search was where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canines and helicopters and these huge search teams, some of which had thermal cameras which would allow you to see body heat, despite covering this vast area all around where Brandon clearly had been, there was absolutely no sign of him. And they also spoke to the homeowners and the property owners sort of roughly in the area to see if maybe they'd seen something strange, maybe seen Brandon or those 3 men that apparently had been chasing him on the night he went missing, but nobody had seen anything. And so, basically, Brandon was definitely not here. And there was no sign he had been here other than his truck. That was it. And so, Deputy Neil and the rest of the authorities who were involved in this search ultimately came to the conclusion that based on the fact that Brandon had clearly been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he had not been seen in days and there was no sign of him anywhere, nothing, that what must have happened here is Brandon fled, that he is not here because he chose not to be here, that he was never in any danger. He fled the area, and looking here is going to do nothing. We basically have to wait for Brandon to show up at some point. And so, for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a bombshell. On August 13th, 2013, so 4 days after Brandon went missing, this is right around the time the search has been called off. The officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa. And Ledessa looked extremely upset, and she said that she had gotten so worried about Brandon that she had started searching through their cell phone records, and she had found something really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper and she handed it to the officer, and she pointed at a specific section. And this officer, he realized quickly that this was a printed out copy of Brandon's call logs, and what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. on the night he disappeared. In between a flurry of calls to Kyle and also to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 actually terrified her because Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid the police. He was terrified of the police. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even suggested to him that he should run from the police on the night he went missing when he saw the cop approaching him. And so she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But she is like, why then, after calling the police, did he presumably run away? It just does not make any sense. And all of this came as a total surprise to this officer and to the sheriff's department, because until this moment, the belief had been that a trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver, and that was how Deputy Neil got involved, and really this whole thing started. But nobody knew there had also been this other 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch in the area was tiny, underfunded, and understaffed, and at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball when it came to informing the sheriff's department about Brandon's 911 call, because they really did not know about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department would contact that 911 dispatch, and they would send them an audio recording of Brandon's call. And when they listened to it, they were shocked. Because, one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent danger. This was not like a low-stakes call from a stranded driver. This was someone who thought they were in real peril here. And then, too, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call. Shortly before it cuts out, on the recording, you hear the dispatcher say, 911 emergency. And Brandon replies, yes, I am in the middle of a field. I just pushed some guys over right here, going toward Javelina on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There is one car here, to the woods, pretty hard. The dispatcher, clearly confused, says, okay, now run that by me again. And Brandon says, we are not talking to him. I accidentally ran into him. The dispatcher says, you ran into him. Okay. Do you need an ambulance? And Brandon says, yeah, no, I need the cops. The dispatcher asks, is anybody hurt? Hello, hello, hello? But Brandon was gone, and so at this point, authorities are thinking, okay, this does not necessarily seem like this is just a disappearance. This might be a murder. I mean, they did not have a body, but the idea that there is another voice, and he is talking about being chased through the woods, and there are these men coming after him, this audio recording gave a lot of legitimacy to that. And so the search, which had just ended, was quickly resumed and expanded dramatically. And for the next year, with all these additional resources being poured in, there was this massive effort to find Brandon Lawson, but they did not find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that highway 277, all over the place near where his truck was. There was no evidence. He was just gone. And so, ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. And for the most part, authorities just kind of moved on. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ledessa, would go on to hire 2 private detectives, and they would both conduct these big searches multiple times over around the area where Brandon left his truck and also across the state. But they, too, also just came up empty. And as the years passed by without answers, Brandon's disappearance captured more people's attention, and it started being featured on TV shows and podcasts. People had all kinds of theories about what had happened. You know, maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere and got attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by these 3 men, and they kidnapped or killed him. And maybe that voice you hear on the recording was one of those 3 men. Or maybe he really had just fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department originally thought. Nobody really knew. And so, for 9 years, Brandon's case was full of questions and 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277, to the area where Brandon had disappeared, which had been searched so many times over. This small group of volunteers would make the biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were combing through this field off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They called the sheriff's department, and very quickly a team of deputies arrived and cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that same field, not far from the shorts and the shoes, they found a fragment of a human skull. And DNA testing confirmed the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually it just made the whole thing more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near his truck. It had been searched so many times. There were thermal cameras and canines and helicopters and hundreds of searchers, and nobody found it. Remember, off the side of the highway, this is not some thick forest. It is like this huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass and short cactus plants and scattered trees. Like, this is an easy place to find stuff, yet this skull fragment was not found, nor were the shorts or the shoes. It just seems so improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is, despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, the hundreds of volunteers and searchers that combed this area for years, they just did not see the grown man in bright white sneakers who was in this barren strip of West Texas, where it is easy to see anything. They just did not see him. So, that's option 1. Or option 2, he was not there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were looking for him. He was somewhere else. But if you believe option 2, the question becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? Why? Where was he? And then, also, even if you answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes wind up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still do not have a good answer. If you think the mystery of Brandon Lawson's remains in a West Texas field is hard to wrap your head around, let us travel back in time to late 19th century Pennsylvania, where a mother and daughter found themselves trapped in a house haunted by a terrifying sound, a sound that seemed to be communicating with them from beyond the grave. On the night of May 3, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and listened really intently to figure out where the sound was coming from. But she just could not do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house. And at one point, it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. I mean, it really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint, and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house, but then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it is 2 or 3 in the morning, and it is just total silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well clearly it was some animal, or maybe it is a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. You know, she is rationalizing the sound. It is gone now, so it cannot be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing this sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away, tragically 11 years earlier, in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of his death. This was something that they really had never been able to move past. And so, as Mary is laying here in bed and she is hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks, maybe it is Cora. Maybe she is doing something. But really, what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt, and how badly she missed her husband. Like, she really just wished he was here, because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate, I am going to stay here, you go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He had been gone for over a decade, and so eventually, even though Mary really did not want to get up and go look for this tapping sound because, truthfully, she was just scared at this point, but she is thinking about her daughter, Cora, who is downstairs, and, you know, heaven forbid there is some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house, and it could be hazardous, she does not know. So, she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter is okay. And on top of that, her daughter Cora had recently had this really bad case of strep throat. And while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, you know, this is an opportunity, as much as anything, to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she is okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage, and she takes her sheets off, and she gets up out of her bed, and at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It is all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she is out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door, and there is nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she is looking out, but there is nothing. The house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It was like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly, all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what, the sound has stopped, everything is okay, I am sure Cora is okay, I am getting back in bed and I am going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed, she did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled them up to her chin, and just hoped the sound would not come back. And it did not. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately took stock and realized, okay, you know, I am okay, everything seems fine in the house. She listened and did not hear any knocking sounds. And she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits, and so Mary just kind of breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign, but there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat, and then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she did not really even know what to make of it. She was kind of spooked by it, did not want to scare her daughter, so it never came up, but they are chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there is very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts, not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the exact same sound she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora, as well as looking at her mom like, did you hear that? And Mary's like, you heard that too. You heard that tapping. And Cora is like, yeah, I think it is coming from the cellar. And Mary, she is like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, well, it sounds like it is in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they are rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is. And so Mary, who at this point is desperate to find a logical, non-scary explanation for what is going on here, just immediately goes down the stairs into the cellar and begins looking for mice. That would prove that's all this is. It is mice making these sounds, but when she is down there, she is looking around and there are no mice. There is no sign of mice. And as she is down there, she starts hearing the tapping again. But now, it is not coming from the cellar where they thought the sounds were originating. It is coming from somewhere above her. And as soon as Mary hears this tapping sound, she hears Cora reacting to it upstairs in the kitchen, like she was kind of startled by it. And so, Mary runs back upstairs to the kitchen, she looks at Cora, and Cora is visibly distressed because she is like, I heard it was in here, it was in the kitchen or somewhere nearby, I did not see anything, but I heard it. As soon as you went down there, I heard it. And so, at this point, Mary is undeniably scared. She does not know what this is, but it has gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so, Mary said, you know what, I am going next door. They had a friend who lived next door. Guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door, and when he came, she explained that there is something happening. There are knocking sounds happening in my house. It is scaring me and Cora. We cannot figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, absolutely, I will be over in a second. And so Mary goes back to her house, and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen, and periodically they are hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over. He comes inside, and right away when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary is like, what is that? And Cora, she is totally spooked, and the guy is like, I think it is your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is. And so Mary and Cora, they are like, great. He seems pretty confident that that's all this is. And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he is checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he is checking all these different areas that as he is checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it is not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he is working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, the tapping got really loud. And it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing because it is nowhere near here. It is behind us. And the man, he turned around and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face was ashen, he really looked pretty upset, and he said, the last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they could not get out, and they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like. After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, I am sorry, I cannot help you. And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so, Mary and Cora, they are left wondering, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she could not believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. I mean, he knows she is grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she is thinking about what he told her, that it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if these are ghosts? What if it is my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued, and the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they would come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house, and sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they would all hear the tapping sounds. And nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers. People are talking about it all over the place. And in some ways, that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight. But they also really did not know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they are sitting at the table weighing out their options. Like, what do we even do? Even if this is our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we cannot live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on and on, do we eventually move? And so they are having that kind of discussion. And as they are sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It is practically on top of Mary and Cora. So much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started. And they both kind of looked at each other like, it is right on top of us, what's going on? And then, as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she was sitting back, she saw something. Something she had never noticed before, and immediately she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So, Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat and she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And Sydenham's chorea has a very different set of symptoms compared to strep throat. This condition, which is also historically known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly or twitch and not even know they are doing it. And so, what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound but had absolutely no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by Sydenham's chorea. Now, it seems like, well, how did Mary not catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times Mary was not in the same room as her daughter, and her daughter did not know she was making the tapping sounds. So, her daughter is genuinely scared of the tapping sounds because she does not know she is making them. And Mary does not know it is her daughter making them. And so, combined, they are like, oh my gosh, what's happening in our house? And then, before long, they had kind of gone down this path of, it is my dead husband, it is my dead father, he is the one making these sounds. And then it is like they had tunnel vision, as did all the other neighbors, as did the reporters. Everybody wanted this, in some ways, to be a haunting. And so, nobody is checking to see if maybe Cora is tapping her feet or hands and creating these tapping sounds, because again, Cora was fully convinced she was not making those sounds. But then, finally, when she and her mom were sitting at the table discussing what they were going to do, 6 days after the haunting began and they hear this really intense, close tapping sound, when Mary kind of leaned back to take stock of the room and figure out what was going on, she noticed under the table Cora's foot stomping on the ground. Cora did not even know she was doing it. It was Sydenham's chorea. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.